On September the 8th, 1900, a massive Category 4 hurricane struck the coastal island city of Galveston, Texas, with winds reaching a devastating 140 miles per hour. The storm destroyed over 7,000 buildings and killed 6,000 to 12,000 people, making it the deadliest natural disaster in US history by a long mile. For reference, this storm was 5 times deadlier than Katrina and caused more deaths than the next 6 deadliest mainland US hurricanes combined. This is the story of the Galveston Hurricane. If you were living prior to the late 1800s and wanted to know what the weather was going to be, you were largely doing it based on your own superstition, law, and homegrown theory. Some tools for meteorological observation did exist and began to see increasing use for real-time measurement around this time in history, but large-scale predictive forecasting was very much in its infancy, and as the US began to industrialize, there became more urgent calls for better weather forecasting. There were 500 independent weather stations across the United States, but no one service that could yet provide accurate national readings and track or warn of the violent coastal storms that battered the Gulf Coast. So in 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant would establish the United States Weather Bureau under the command of the US Army Signal Service to meet the growing demand for weather forecasting. But again, because meteorology was still in its early days, the Bureau quickly gained a reputation for often comical inaccuracy. For example, on Monday 12, 1888, the Signal Corps forecast for New York predicted colder, brisk westerly winds and fair weather. What hit was a storm that killed over 200 people. It probably didn't help that the fledgling service quickly became embroiled in a major embezzlement scandal. Congress was actually forced to launch an investigation into widespread corruption that plagued the Bureau at all levels. For example, one station in the Midwest was ran by a man with a serious gambling problem. To secure his debts, he hawked the station's weather equipment to a nearby pawnbroker. His route to the office took a slight detour each morning so that he could take a reading out of the back of the pawnbroker's stockroom. None of this really did anything to assuage the public's concerns with the agency. The answer Congress saw was to appoint a man who may well have been the Joseph Stalin of weather forecasting. Willis L. Moore was brought in as bureau chief in 1895, and he would rule it with an iron fist. Moore believed the best way to clean up the agency's poor reputation was to do 2 things. The first was to rein in his staff by adopting an extremely centralized approach to management. Observers were simply banned from bringing intuition, folklore, or subjective personal feelings into any weather reports. Gone were the days of wildly speculative forecasting. Instead, his observers were told to now focus on highly objective, scientific and precise measurements of near-current weather. And secondly, he tightly controlled agency communications to reduce unnecessary public fear. So no individual weather station was allowed, for example, to publicly use words in their report that might incite panic, such as hurricane, or warn against adverse weather conditions without the express permission of Washington. Individual employees were regularly inspected and had periodic competitions against each other for accuracy, which, although it did inspire a culture of improvement, also definitely created a tense and paranoid atmosphere. Moore had taken it upon himself to not only build its reputation, but to ensure the absolute unquestionable supremacy of the United States Weather Service. Moore hated the Cubans, and more specifically their weather service. For a start, the Cuban meteorologists were regarded as some of the best in the world, with the Belén Observatory in Havana, then led by the Jesuit Father Lorenzo Gangoite, pioneering the art of hurricane prediction. It was the Belén Observatory that first realized in the late 1870s that the rabos de gallo of cirrus clouds often foretold the arrival of a hurricane, and using a skilled network of observers armed via telegraph, the Cubans were able to make accurate tracking and prediction of storm movements over the Atlantic for the first time ever. But the Spanish-American War had just concluded with the US victorious, and the idea that the primitive and naive Cuban meteorologists might well be better than the US was simply unthinkable, especially to an infamously narcissistic man like Moore. He regarded storm forecasting as mere quackery, and he couldn't really envision a scenario in which the Cubans knew more than he did about storm formation. He concocted a dubious narrative that Catholic spies in New Orleans were transmitting official Bureau forecasts forecasts via a submarine cable directly to Havana to artificially boost the accuracy of Cuban forecasting. Because the Spanish-American War had ended with Cuba under the charge of the US War Department, Moore used his authority to justify banning all Cuban weather forecasts from telegram or direct transmission, with his own bureau being the only service remaining. Effectively, this gave Moore complete control over the weather. If God was going to send a storm, it was Willis Moore who would give him approval. On August 27th, a ship 1,000 nautical miles off the coast of the Windward Islands detected a small tropical cyclone moving northwest over the Caribbean, and those on the ground remarked that where the clouds would usually dissipate as this happened, they only seemed to be getting darker. A few days later, Father Gangoite's observatory began tracking this small storm as it travelled up the southern coast of Cuba, and on September 5th, a persistent halo was visible around the moon above Havana, along with a northward bound cirrus cloud drifting across a deep red sky. What this basically indicated was a small storm still in its formative stages, likely to intensify before moving up the Gulf towards the coast of Texas. Father Gangoite informed Moore at once. However, the US Weather Bureau's position couldn't have been more different. They were adamant that this was not a hurricane but a small disturbance that would make landfall in Florida and impact the east coast heading back out over the Atlantic, a report that he authorized to be pushed out to all US Bureau stations. To Moore, Father Gangoite's worrying reports were yet another example of the Cubans causing unnecessary panic, exactly why his ban was needed. One of the observers who received Moore's notice of a tropical disturbance, the Bureau's coded reference for a storm, was Isaac Klein, a well-respected and very competent meteorologist who, just a year prior, had been assigned to oversee a station on the small coastal city of Galveston, Texas. Galveston was a boomtown that had just recently grown to the fourth largest population in Texas, with one of the highest per capita income rates in the entire United States. It was a very popular destination for businessmen and artists, with a section of downtown called the Strand being considered the Wall Street of the Southwest. Isaac lived in Galveston with his pregnant wife and 3 children, along with his brother Joseph, a fellow meteorologist who worked with Isaac at his station. At several points in history, citizens of Galveston were concerned that, with their highest point reaching only 8.7 foot above sea level, a protective wall should be constructed along the waterline to mitigate any storm damage. However, much like Moore, Isaac never seriously considered a storm could ever cause serious damage to a Gulf Coast city. Galveston had endured several small storms previously without any major damage, and in 1891, when he was invited by the Galveston News to assess the city's vulnerability to storms, he confidently stated the belief held by some that Galveston will at some time be seriously damaged by a hurricane is simply an absurd delusion. The seawall was not constructed. On Thursday the 8th, a small passenger ship called the Louisiana was sailing through the Gulf of Mexico. At 6 AM, the captain saw the ship's barometer reading 29.6 inches. It wasn't overly concerning to the ship's veteran captain, T.P. Halsey, as he had survived 8 tropical cyclones in the Gulf waters so far. However, the fact that the pressure then dropped to 28.75 by midday certainly was. In fact, he had never seen a barometer go so low in his entire life. This storm battered the Louisiana, wave after wave striking the ship's deck. The captain estimated winds of over 100 miles an hour, at this point making it a Category 3 storm, and it was moving towards the Gulf Coast. It took over a day for the US Bureau to actually admit this latter point, however they still maintained it was not of hurricane speed, the consequence being that very few people in the likely path of the storm took the threat seriously. On the morning of September 8th, Buford Morris, a travelling real estate agent, looked out of his bedroom window in Galveston, noting the sky seemed to be made of mother of pearl, gloriously pink yet containing a fish scale effect which reflected all the colours of the rainbow. Never had I seen such a beautiful sky. Although a general warning had been sounded in Galveston, very few people evacuated due to the largely unremarkable weather conditions and the downplayed wording of the alarm. However, a very different sky was visible to the Pensacola, a ship 115 miles southeast of Galveston. The Pensacola swung from its anchor in seas turned luminous by lightning and exploding rain. Based on the way his ship was being thrashed about, Captain Simmons believed a massive storm was travelling directly towards Galveston. However, without a radio, there was just no way he could warn them. First came the water. Throughout the afternoon, water rose across the island. 8-year-old Henry Courts was visiting his grandmother and noticed that her back garden, and indeed much of her neighbourhood, was under about 2 foot of water. He saw children navigating the water in washtubs and homemade rafts and thought it was amazing. By around midday, the sea had rose to such a level that streetcars no longer ran on much of the island. Rain struck like pebbles and a strong wind blew through the street. Downtown near the city centre, few paid much attention to the storm. Being only 8 foot above sea level, Galveston was no stranger to a bit of flooding. One of those who paid it little mind was Stanley Spencer, an out-of-town steamship agent, who was at a popular restaurant called Ritter's Cafe to discuss an upcoming business deal. The men talked work and ate in relative peace, but in the back of their mind an increasing fear began to creep in. As patrons came and left, an ever stronger wind blew increasingly ferociously through the open door and shook the windows in their frame. Suddenly, a powerful gust of wind tore off the building's roof, collapsing it into the upper floor and cascading down into the restaurant. Spencer and 4 other men were killed instantly, injuring another 5. Quickly, a huge crowd formed outside the restaurant, including Isaac Klein, who ran over from his office only a block or so away. Suddenly, the mood in Galveston changed. As the water levels increasingly rose, Isaac went against official policy and issued a storm warning for Galveston without permission from Washington. It was the first time anyone in Galveston had actual notice of a hurricane, but things were going to get a lot worse. At about 7:30 p.m, the water rose 4 foot in 4 seconds. By this point, those whose phone line still works were clogged with stories from around the island of water up to people's necks or waves striking people's front doors. Rumours circulated correctly that the massive Victorian bathhouses on the waterfront had collapsed into the sea. Over the next hour, the water rose by another 5 foot, and by this point, the entire island was submerged under the Gulf. A businessman named David Benjamin was travelling by train from Houston to Galveston when, around noon, the tracks became entirely swamped by water. A relief train arrived, and when they finally reached the station, all the male passengers had to form a human chain to ferry women and children through the strong current and onto the platform. Unable to find the man Benjamin was due to meet, he stayed at the train station. Many passengers also opted to remain sheltered on the second floor of the building, as the ground floor had already been flooded. Benjamin noted that despite the storm outside, many people were relatively unconcerned until a particularly horrifying moment where the body of a child floated into the station. At this point, people began to panic. Further over on the island, a train from Beaumont, Texas also got stuck at Bolivar Point. John H. Poe, a member of the Louisiana State Board of Education, was on board. Stuck unable to progress further, the conductor ordered the train back to Beaumont as water began flowing directly into the coaches. With the train engine quickly flooded, their attempt failed, and the passengers were left to decide whether to stay on board the half-submerged, stranded train or venture out into the waters in the hope of finding safety. Poe and 9 other passengers made a break for the only building they could see still above the water, the Beaumont Lighthouse. About 85 others remained on board. Poe waded through the waist-deep waters and, upon reaching the lighthouse's main door, realized 200 refugees were already crammed inside, winding up the staircase. He was the last man to enter before the sea blocked the front door. The train did eventually make it further down the track, but when it was found the next morning, all 85 passengers were dead. In fact, throughout the night, the final recorded wind speed from the weather station was 100 miles per hour just after midnight, before the anemometer was blown off the roof. The true wind speed was estimated to have been over 120 miles per hour, a Category 4 storm. The city of Galveston was simply not built to withstand this. As the day progressed, all bridges to the island and 15 miles of railroad track were destroyed. Electrical, telegraph and telephone lines were all downed, isolating the city entirely. All streets suffered water damage, but worse than anything was the wall of debris. The force of the storm surge created a 3-story tall wall of wreckage made of homes, rooftops, furniture, pianos, clothes and human corpses. It had the unintended effect of sheltering much of the city from the waves. However, it slowly marched through Galveston, pushing a ridge with an unstoppable momentum that scraped the city clean of all structures and life like a bulldozer. Those near it described worse than anything was the sound, a horrendous blend of screaming, exploding wood and scraping metal. The seawall began eviscerating much of the southeastern and western sides of Galveston, leaving only the inland north. 125-mile-per-hour winds sent debris flying with missile velocity. The wind launched roof slates with a speed that severed limbs and fractured skulls. After Joseph and Isaac Klein had spent most of the day in the office, the two returned back to Isaac's house to shelter with his wife and children at about 5:30 p.m. and found it occupied with around 50 other refugees who believed the Klein house was stronger than most. It said that Isaac and his brother debated quite fiercely over some time whether to evacuate or remain in place. Many of the houses in the neighborhood had collapsed, and Joseph believed that theirs would likely follow soon, but Isaac thought that the outside was too dangerous for his currently sick and pregnant wife to safely make passage through. Unfortunately, Joseph would prove correct in this situation. A trestle struck the support struts of the house, causing it to slide from its foundation and list, collapsing into the water. As the house broke apart, Isaac would save his youngest daughter, grabbing her in the water, and Joseph, having sensed the imminent collapse, grabbed hold of Isaac's two eldest children. However, his wife and infant daughter would not survive. This was far from a unique story. Further down the beach was the St. Mary's Orphanage, a stone fortress-like building with 93 children resident and 10 sisters looking after them. Waves battered the building all day long, forcing the sisters to move from room to room as portions of the building began collapsing into the sea. The sisters eventually herded all the children into the girls' dormitory and tied clotheslines around most of the children to keep everyone together. The storm advanced through the building, the sea and wind bursting into the dormitory. In seconds, the building failed. 90 children and all 10 sisters disappeared into the water. When later a rescuer tried lifting a child's body he found on the beach, he realized the line was connected to another 8 children and a nun, buried in the sand. The clothesline had tangled many together, preventing their escape, and only 3 older children survived who had not been tied together. The next morning, on Sunday 9th, the Galveston storm had significantly reduced in severity and was no longer considered a hurricane as it continued its journey up through the northern hemisphere. The Pensacola lifted its anchor and charted a course back towards the city of Galveston, and arriving back at port, the men quickly fell silent. They had left a city only to return to a desolate hellscape. Bodies were strewn everywhere, and a 1,000-acre portion of land had been utterly obliterated. Throughout the night, the city's fort's cannons had boomed out over the sound of the wind, and citizens thought the soldiers were firing off the cannons as a way to reassure people. In fact, it was a beg for help. The fort had been entirely leveled too. Huge swaths of the city were now just entirely gone, and in its place a sea of timber. Already the smell of putrefaction was overpowering to the men as they stepped off their boat. One of the only ships to survive in Galveston was the Ferriby, which was dispatched to Texas City to send a short message to Governor Joseph D. Sayers and President William McKinley saying, "I have been deputized by the Mayor and Citizens Committee of Galveston to inform you that the city of Galveston is in ruins, and it estimated 500 dead, which at the time was still considered to be an exaggeration." In Texas City, groups of rescuers, relief officials, and damage surveyors immediately began making the journey to Galveston. A small lifeboat vessel from the Galveston ship Kendall Castle was commandeered by General McKibben, one of the leads, who later mentioned, "I am an old soldier. I have seen many battlefields, but let me tell you, since I rowed across the bay the other night and helped the man at the boat to steer clear of the floating bodies of dead women and little children, I have not slept one moment." They were joined by volunteers and professional rescuers and aid staff from around America, including Clara Barton, the then 78-year-old founder of the American Red Cross. Many survivors of the storm would later die buried under the wreckage, and those otherwise fine had little to live on as the city was in complete ruins. Even burying all the bodies was impossible. The Morrison and Formey Company survey in 1901 indicated a population loss of 8,124, with most estimates placing the death toll between 6,000 and 12,000. African American men were recruited at gunpoint to load bodies collected by dead gangs onto barges to be buried at sea, only for them to return with the tide. Therefore, mass burnings were ordered wherever it was expedient. These mass cremations were burning on street corners 24/7 for several weeks after the storm. The smell of burning body and hair was mixed with the putrefied remains of those buried too deep in the wreckage to extract easily, so authorities passed out free whiskey to sustain the men conscripted to to collect and dispose of the dead. The Galveston News published a single sheet on Sunday morning, headed "Following is a list of dead as accurately as newsmen have been able to make it," and followed a 2-column list of names for which months after would steadily grow. As well as the loss of life, the Galveston storm caused about $34 million in damages, which adjusted for inflation would be about $104 billion. For comparison, Hurricane Katrina cost $125 billion, over 90,000 square miles, which really shows how concentrated the destruction was in Galveston. 17,000 survivors were made temporarily homeless and were housed in surplus US Army tents along the shore and in vacant storerooms and public buildings. 10,000 had their homes entirely destroyed. To protect against future storms, Galveston built a seawall which, at its completion in 1963, had reached a total length of 10 miles. Approximately 11 million meters cubed of sand was dredged to raise the city by as much as 17 foot in places. Over 2,100 buildings were individually raised by pumping sand underneath the island, and when the city was hit again by another hurricane in 1915, only 53 people died, proving the effectiveness of the new measures. For Isaac and Joseph, the storm would actually end their personal relationship. The two brothers were never able to reconcile after the trauma. Isaac would move to New Orleans and remarried, retiring as a well-respected meteorologist, and to this day, the Weather Service's highest commendation for observers is the Isaac M. Klein Award. Despite Moore's heavily criticized management style and his narcissistic, petty rivalry with the Cubans, ultimately playing no small part in making the Galveston Hurricane the US's single deadliest natural disaster, he would continue leading the Bureau for another 13 years before he was muscled out and forced to resign amid bureaucratic squabbling over spending. The Galveston Hurricane permanently altered the shape of Texas, as business would never return to the same scale as before. Nearby Houston was considered a much safer investment for business and as a place to live, and its growth far accelerated Galveston's after 1900. And this story remains as a testament to two of nature's most destructive forces: the ferocious and uncontrollable power of storms and the hubris of man. This was the Crux Files, and thanks for watching.